My name is Ethan, I'm 31, and I build things for a living. I'm a contractor, and for most of my life, I've found more comfort in the solid, predictable nature of wood and concrete than I ever did in the company of my own family. Things have a purpose. A beam holds a roof, a foundation supports a house. They do their job without complaint or manipulation. People, I learned early on, are far more complicated. I'm telling you this because I just got off the most surreal phone call of my life, a call that set in motion the final, explosive collapse of a family dynamic that had been rotting from the inside for 3 decades. The voice on the other end was my father's, his tone a disgusting mix of false bonhomie and steel-edged demand. Ethan, great news, he'd boomed. We've figured out the perfect solution for Chloe's housing situation. I gripped my phone tighter, a cold knot forming in my stomach. I knew where this was going. I had just closed on my first house a week ago. Not just any house, but the house. The one I'd been saving for, dreaming of, since I was a teenager sketching floor plans on scrap paper. That new place you bought, he continued, his voice oozing entitlement, it's a bit big for a single guy like you. Chloe needs a stable place to work on her art. So, we all agree, the best thing to do is for you to just sign it over to her. I was silent, the sheer audacity of it sucking the air from my lungs. He took my silence for consideration. Don't worry, son, we'll help you find a nice little apartment closer to your work. It's for the family. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my life was nothing like they imagined. They saw me as their simple, blue-collar son, the reliable cog in the machine, the backup plan. They had no idea about the business I'd built, the quiet success I'd cultivated in the shadows of their neglect. They were about to find out. And it was going to burn their world to the ground. Before I continue with the story of how my parents' greed led them to take their own son to court, do me a favor. If you've ever felt like the family ATM, the forgotten child, or the person whose accomplishments are always minimized, drop a comment below. Hit that like button and subscribe, because you need to hear how this ends. You need to know that you can, and you must, choose your own peace. My childhood was a masterclass in learning how to be invisible. I grew up in a house that orbited around my younger sister, Chloe. She was the sun, a dazzling, vibrant star who captivated my parents' every waking thought. I was a distant, barely there moon, reflecting a tiny fraction of her light and otherwise left in the dark. My father, David, saw in her the creative genius he believed he once was, before settling into a mid-level management job he loathed. My mother, Helen, saw a miniature version of herself, but with all the opportunities she never had. Chloe was going to be an artist, a poet, a world changer. From the moment she could hold a crayon, every scribble was hailed as a masterpiece, every clumsy dance a display of prodigious talent. Our home was a shrine to her. Her paintings, framed and professionally mounted, covered every wall. Her participation trophies for effort in various art classes were displayed more proudly than my academic awards. For my 10th birthday, I asked for a specific Lego set, the big one, the castle. I'd saved up half the money myself from mowing lawns. I remember the morning of my birthday, vibrating with excitement. My parents handed me a small, neatly wrapped box. Inside was a set of work gloves and a new rake. Time to learn the value of hard work, son, my father said with a self-satisfied nod. That afternoon, they threw a surprise party for Chloe. Why? Because she had gotten an F on a finger painting project. Her gift was a brand new, top-of-the-line bicycle that cost more than my entire savings. I spent my birthday raking the leaves in the backyard, watching through the window as they fawned over her, my new gloves feeling rough and alien on my small hands. The pattern was set. When it came time for college, they took out a second mortgage to send Chloe to a prestigious, eye-wateringly expensive art school in another state. There was no discussion of loans or scholarships for her, it was simply provided. When I graduated high school with honors and a partial scholarship to a state university, I was sat down at the kitchen table. "We're so proud of you, Ethan," my mother started, her voice soft and placating. "But with Chloe's tuition, things are tight. You're so practical, so good with your hands. Have you considered trade school? It's a guaranteed job, my father chimed in. A man makes his own way. Your scholarship is a great start. You can work and pay for the rest. It'll build character. The message was clear. Chloe was the investment. I was the utility. They weren't building me up, they were expecting me to be self-sufficient so that every available resource could be funneled into her. It hurt. It hurt more than I ever let on. But they were right about one thing. It did build character. It forged a core of absolute, unshakable self-reliance inside of me. I realized I couldn't count on them for anything, not for money, not for support, and certainly not for validation. So, I learned to count on myself. I enrolled in trade school, worked 2 jobs to pay for it, and watched my sister post photos of her carefree campus life, paid for by the parents who told me I needed to build my own character. Every dollar I earned, every bead of sweat, was a brick in the foundation of the life I would build for myself, far away from their conditional love. My journey to success was quiet, methodical, and deliberately hidden from my family. They never asked, so I never told. After I finished trade school, I took a job as an apprentice with a small, local contracting firm, Miller & Sons Construction. The owner was a man named Frank Miller, a tough, fair, old-school builder in his late 60s. He was everything my father wasn't: direct, honest, and respectful of hard work. He saw something in me on the very first day. While other apprentices were checking their phones or taking long breaks, I was watching, learning, asking questions. I didn't just want to know how to frame a wall, I wanted to know why the studs were 16 inches on center, the physics behind load-bearing structures, the chemistry of curing concrete. Frank started keeping me after hours, not to work, but to teach. He'd spread blueprints across the hood of his truck and show me how to read them, how to bid a job, how to manage a crew and a budget. "You've got the mind for it, kid," he'd say, tapping his temple. Not just the hands, he became the father figure I never had. He celebrated my successes, like when I got my journeyman license, with a firm handshake and a steak dinner. My own father's reaction was a grunt and a, "Well, that's good." Steady work. My family's perception of my life was frozen in time. They thought I was just a laborer for Frank, swinging a hammer for an hourly wage. I lived frugally, renting a small apartment and driving a beat-up truck, pouring every spare dollar I had into savings and investments. I was playing the long game. About 5 years ago, Frank called me into his office. He was retiring. His own sons had no interest in the business. He looked at me across his worn oak desk and made me an offer that changed my life. He offered to sell me the company, the tools, the trucks, the client list, everything. He'd carry the note himself, allowing me to pay him back in installments out of the business's profits. "You built this with me, Ethan," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's only right you're the one to carry it." On the day the papers were signed, I didn't just own a business, I felt like I finally owned my own life. The first thing I did was rebrand. Miller & Sons became Elias Construction, named after my grandfather, my mother's father, a quiet carpenter who had always shown me kindness. I poured my energy into modernizing the company, investing in new technology, and building a reputation for quality and reliability. The business didn't just grow, it exploded. I was landing major contracts, building custom homes, and my profits soared. All the while, to my family, I was just Ethan, who works for that construction guy. I never corrected them. Their disinterest was my shield. It allowed me to build my empire in peace. It was during this time that I met Sarah. She was a landscape architect I collaborated with on a project. She was brilliant, funny, and saw me for who I was, not for who my family thought I was. When I finally told her the whole story about my family, she was horrified. "Ethan, that's not normal," she said, her eyes full of a validation I'd never known. "They don't get to treat you like that." She was the final piece of my chosen family, the support system I had built to replace the one I was born into. And when I finally saved enough to buy my dream house, a beautiful craftsman with enough land for her to design a garden, she was the one who stood by me, knowing it was more than just a house. It was a declaration of independence. The return to the present was jarring, like a needle scratching across a record. My father's voice on the phone, dripping with that sickeningly casual entitlement, shattered the peaceful world I had so carefully constructed. "So, you'll sign the house over to Chloe," he stated, not as a question, but as a foregone conclusion. "We've already spoken to her. She's thrilled. She's finally going to have the space she needs to create her masterpiece." I could almost hear my mother in the background, murmuring her agreement. For a moment, I was that 10-year-old boy again, standing in the yard with a rake while the party went on inside without me. But that boy was long gone. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the silence hang in the air. "No," I said. The word was quiet, but it was as solid and unyielding as a block of granite. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could picture my father's face, the easy smile faltering, confusion clouding his features. "What do you mean, no?" he asked, a sharp edge creeping into his voice. "I mean, no. I am not giving my house to Chloe. I bought it for me. For my future." For Sarah and me, the mention of Sarah was met with a scoff. "Oh, Ethan, be serious. That's just a fling. This is about family. Your sister needs this. You're being incredibly selfish." The accusation was so predictable, so rote, it was almost laughable. For my entire life, my needs were selfish, and Chloe's wants were essential. "It's not selfish to keep what you've earned, Dad," I said, my voice remaining steady. "I worked for this house. Every nail, every board, I earned it." This was when my mother took the phone. Her approach was different, the classic guilt and manipulation she had perfected over years. "Ethan, honey," she began, her voice trembling slightly for dramatic effect. "I don't understand why you're being so difficult. After everything we've done for you, is it so much to ask that you help your own sister? You're breaking my heart, everything you've done for me." The words echoed in my mind. They had done nothing. They had taught me to expect nothing. That was their only gift. I refused to take the bait. "Mom, this isn't up for discussion." "The answer is no." I could hear my father yelling in the background, and then he was back on the line, his voice a low growl. "You listen to me. You will do this. You owe us. You owe your sister. We'll have a family meeting. You'll come to the house on Sunday, and we will sort this out." It was an order, not an invitation. Before I could respond, he hung up. An hour later, my phone buzzed. It was Chloe. I answered, and was met with a barrage of hysterical sobs. "How could you?" she wailed. "You know how much I need this. I've been telling everyone about my new house, my new studio. You're ruining my life. You're destroying my career before it even starts." Listening to her, I felt a profound sense of detachment. She wasn't just entitled, she was living in a completely different reality, a world built for her by our parents where her desires were the center of the universe. The escalation was swift and absolute. They weren't just asking anymore. They were demanding. They were conspiring. And they had no idea who they were dealing with. The battle lines had been drawn, and for the first time in my life, I was ready to fight back. The Sunday meeting felt like walking into an ambush I had willingly agreed to. As Sarah and I pulled up to my parents' house, the same house where my achievements were minimized and my sisters were celebrated, I felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in my chest. But then I looked at Sarah. Her expression was calm and resolute. She squeezed my hand. "You've got this," she whispered. "Just remember who you are." We walked in, and the scene was exactly as I'd pictured. My father stood by the fireplace, arms crossed, trying to project an aura of patriarchal authority. My mother was on the sofa, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, a portrait of the wronged matriarch. And sitting between them, looking smug and impatient, was Chloe. To complete the tribunal, they had invited my Aunt Carol, my mother's sister. She was a kind woman, but easily swayed, and she was clearly there to be that impartial voice of reason that would ultimately side with them. "Ethan, Sarah, thank you for coming," my father began, his tone formal and severe. "We need to talk some sense into you for the next 20 minutes, they laid out their plan in excruciating detail. It was even more delusional than I'd imagined. They spoke of transferring the deed. My father, a man who knew nothing about real estate law, had downloaded some generic forms from the internet and had them sitting on the coffee table. My mother talked about how they would help me move my few things into a one-bedroom apartment they had already scouted online. Chloe chimed in with her own demands, talking about knocking down a wall to create better light for her studio and wanting me to leave behind some of the new appliances. They spoke about my house, as if it were already theirs, a mere logistical problem to be solved. Sarah sat beside me, her composure a silent wall of defiance. I let them talk. I let them empty their chambers of every last round of delusion and entitlement. I watched Aunt Carol's face, saw her initial sympathy for their cause slowly morph into confusion as the sheer audacity of their demands became clear. When my father finally finished his closing statement, "So, it's all settled. It's what's best for everyone," I took a deep breath. The moment had arrived. "There's a fundamental misunderstanding here," I said, my voice cutting through the thick, self-congratulatory atmosphere in the room. They all stared at me. "You seem to be under the impression that I work for Miller & Sons Construction," my father scoffed. "Of course you do. You've worked for Frank for years." "I did work for Frank," I corrected him. "Until he retired 5 years ago. He sold me the business. It's not called Miller & Sons anymore. It's called Elias Construction. And it's mine." I paused, letting the words sink in. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by a faint gasp from my mother. "The house wasn't bought with a foreman's paycheck, Dad," I continued, my gaze locking with his. "It was purchased with the profits from a company that I built into something you can't even imagine. A company you never once, in 5 years, bothered to ask me a single question about." The shock on their faces was a sight to behold. It was a slow-motion car crash of emotion. My mother's mouth hung open. Aunt Carol's eyes were wide with disbelief. Chloe just looked confused, as if I were speaking a foreign language. But my father. His expression was the most revealing. The shock melted away almost instantly, replaced by a flash of raw, naked greed. The cogs were turning in his head, the calculations flying. He looked at me not as a son, but as an untapped resource he had just discovered. His first words confirmed it. "My God," he whispered, looking right through me. "How much is it worth?" The revelation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. My father's question, "How much is it worth?" was not about my well-being or my success. It was the sound of a prospector striking gold. The dynamic in the room shifted instantly. Their shock curdled into a new, more aggressive form of entitlement. "Well then," my father boomed, slapping his knee as if this were fantastic news for his grand plan. "If you own the whole company, then you can most certainly afford to give your sister the house. In fact, you should be doing more for us. We're your family." Chloe, finally grasping the situation, perked up. "He's right," she exclaimed, her voice losing its whiny edge and taking on a demanding tone. "You've been holding out on us. You have all this money, and you've been letting us think you were just some worker. You owe us. You owe me that house." My mother, recovering from her swoon, nodded vigorously. "She's right, Ethan. It's your duty. We supported you all those years, we raised you so you could become successful like this. This success belongs to the whole family." The absurdity was breathtaking. They were trying to claim credit for a victory they didn't even know I was fighting for. They hadn't supported me, they had created the conditions that forced me to succeed without them. That's when Sarah's hand found mine, her touch grounding me. I looked at her, and she gave me a small, determined nod. It was all the strength I needed. I stood up, pulling her up with me. "No," I said, and this time the word wasn't quiet. It was a declaration. It echoed in the suddenly silent room. "My success is not yours. It's mine. It belongs to me, to the years I worked 80-hour weeks, to the nights I spent learning how to run a business instead of going out. It belongs to Frank, who believed in me when you didn't. It belongs to Sarah, who loves me for who I am, not for what I can provide." I turned to my parents. "You didn't support me. You ignored me. You taught me that I could only rely on myself, and I thank you for that one lesson. I learned it well. So, no. I will not be giving my house to Chloe. I will not be funding her life of artistic delusion. I will not be your retirement plan. I looked at Chloe, whose face was a mask of indignant rage. And you, I said, my voice softening with a final, weary pity. You don't need a house. You need to grow up. We turned to leave. My father started sputtering. You can't just walk away. This isn't over. But we didn't stop. I opened the front door and walked out into the cool afternoon air, Sarah's hand held firmly in mine. As the door clicked shut behind us, I felt a physical sensation, as if a great, heavy chain that had been wrapped around my chest for 30 years had just shattered and fallen away. I could breathe. For the first time, leaving that house, I felt completely and utterly free. The standoff was over. I had established the ultimate boundary, and I had chosen myself. I left them there, in the wreckage of their own greed, and I didn't look back. The weeks following that disastrous family meeting were a masterclass in manipulation and attempted emotional warfare. Walking away had been liberating, but it was like kicking a hornet's nest. My family, realizing they had lost all direct control, launched a multi-front campaign to regain it. The first wave was the smear campaign. My father began calling relatives, aunts, uncles, cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. He spun a tale of a cold, heartless son who had stumbled into a fortune and was now hoarding it from his struggling family, particularly his poor, artistically gifted sister who only needed a small boost to achieve greatness. Some of them bought it, and I received a few sanctimonious texts about the importance of family. Others, like Aunt Carol who had witnessed the climax firsthand, knew the truth and either stayed silent or offered me quiet words of support. The second wave was my mother's emotional blackmail. I was inundated with long, rambling voicemails and text messages, sent at all hours of the night. They were filled with phrases like, I can't eat, I can't sleep, you're tearing this family apart, and the classic, how could you do this to me, your mother? She painted a picture of a family in tatters, with me as the sole architect of its destruction. For a brief, flickering moment, the old guilt tried to surface, the ingrained programming to be the good, responsible son. But Sarah was my rock. She's not sad that you're hurting, Ethan, she reminded me gently one evening as I stared at another manipulative text. She's angry that you're no longer compliant. Then came the final, most desperate assault, the legal threat. A crisp, formal envelope arrived in my mailbox. Inside was a letter from a law firm I'd never heard of. It was a cease and desist letter filled with legal jargon, but the message was clear: my parents were threatening to sue me. They were claiming I had a fiduciary duty to my family and that my success was the result of their lifelong emotional and financial investment, for which they were now seeking restitution. Their primary demand was the transfer of the house to Chloe. As per their verbal agreement, it was utterly insane. I laughed at first, but the humor quickly faded. They were actually going to take me to court. My own parents. This was their endgame. I wasn't just the ungrateful son anymore, I was a legal adversary. Supported by Sarah and my chosen family, Frank, who was appalled but not surprised, and my crew at work who had my back unconditionally, I refused to buckle. I hired my own lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ms. Albright. I laid out the whole story for her, from the childhood neglect to the details of my business. She listened patiently, read their lawyer's letter, and a slow, incredulous smile spread across her face. Mr. Elias, she said, leaning back in her chair. In my 20 years of practicing family and civil law, this is one of the most ludicrous claims I have ever seen. It's an emotional tantrum dressed up in legal threats. But, she leaned forward, her expression turning serious, we must treat it as a real threat, because their desperation makes them unpredictable. The fallout was severe, and the manipulation was relentless. But I was no longer the boy who could be controlled by guilt or intimidation. They had forged me in a fire of neglect, and it had made me stronger than they could ever comprehend. I would not break. The legal battle my parents initiated was less of a dramatic courtroom showdown and more of a slow, humiliating fizzle for them. Their lawyer, likely realizing the weakness of his case, tried a few blustering tactics, sending letters filled with baseless accusations and demands for financial disclosure. On the advice of Ms. Albright, we responded calmly and factually, refusing to be drawn into an emotional slugfest. We provided a concise history of my employment and the legal, arm's-length purchase of the business from Frank Miller, complete with signed affidavits. We systematically dismantled their claim of a lifelong financial investment by pointing out their explicit refusal to fund my education and the complete lack of any financial support since I turned 18. The entire case hinged on their absurd notion of familial obligation being legally binding. The breaking point came during a preliminary hearing. It wasn't a full trial, just a meeting in a judge's chambers to determine if the case even had merit to proceed. I sat there with Ms. Albright, watching my parents and a visibly uncomfortable Chloe sit with their lawyer across the table. My father tried to put on a show for the judge, speaking of family values and a son's duty. My mother tried to cry. The judge, a stern, weary-looking man in his 60s, was having none of it. He listened for about 10 minutes, his expression growing more and more impatient. He then turned to my parents' lawyer. "Counselor," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Are you seriously bringing this before me? You're asking this court to enforce a non-existent verbal contract to compel a man to give a $500,000 asset to his sister based on what? Hurt feelings? This is a flagrant abuse of the judicial process." He then looked directly at my parents. "You should be proud of your son, not trying to fleece him. I am dismissing this case with prejudice. And if you ever bring something this frivolous into my courtroom again, I will consider sanctions for wasting the court's time." The humiliation in that room was palpable. My father's face was purple with rage. My mother looked small and defeated. Chloe just stared at the floor. They had played their final card, and it had been publicly and resoundingly rejected. The consequences of their actions rippled outwards. To pay for their legal folly, they had taken out a second mortgage on their home, a fact I learned later from Aunt Carol. The public dismissal of the case meant the truth of the situation spread through our extended family and their social circles. They were no longer the victims of a greedy son, they were seen as the grasping, entitled parents they were. Chloe, deprived of her free mansion and facing the reality of her own inaction, reportedly had a meltdown, running up thousands on my mother's credit cards before moving in with a friend, leaving my parents to deal with the financial fallout alone. While their world was imploding, mine was finally healing. Sarah and I poured our love into the house. We planted a garden, painted the walls colors that made us happy, and filled the rooms with laughter. I reconnected with my chosen family, hosting barbecues for my work crew and having long dinners with Frank, who took immense pride in my standing up for myself. I started seeing a therapist to unpack the complex emotions tied to 30 years of neglect. It was hard work, but with every session, I felt lighter. I was building a new foundation, not of concrete and wood, but of peace, respect, and unconditional love. I was finally, truly, home. Almost a year passed in relative silence. It was a year of profound peace and growth for me. Sarah and I got engaged in the garden we had built together. Elias Construction landed its biggest contract to date. My life was moving forward, powered by the freedom I had fought so hard to win. The silence from my family was a gift, but I knew the story wasn't quite over. The consequences of their actions were still unfolding. The first sign came from Aunt Carol. She called me, her voice hesitant. She told me my parents were in serious financial trouble. The second mortgage, combined with Chloe's credit card debts and their own prideful spending, had pushed them to the brink. They were facing foreclosure. They had alienated many of their friends, and the family was keeping a respectful distance, knowing the drama they had created. They were isolated and humbled, not by a change of heart, but by cold, hard reality. I felt a pang, not of guilt, but of a distant, sorrowful pity. They had done this to themselves. A few weeks later, my phone rang. The caller ID read Mom. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the decline button. But something made me answer. I said nothing, just listened. "Ethan." Her voice was small, fragile, stripped of all its manipulative theatricality. It was a voice I hadn't heard in years. I know you have no reason to want to talk to me. And I'm not calling to ask for anything. She took a shaky breath. I wanted to say, I'm sorry. We were wrong. I was wrong. The apology was clumsy, imperfect. It was followed by a string of justifications. We just loved Chloe so much, your father was so stressed, but buried within the excuses was a kernel of something I believed was genuine remorse. We were so focused on the daughter we wanted to have, we never saw the son we did have, she said, and this time, she was weeping for real. We took you for granted. We saw your strength and we used it as an excuse to neglect you. I am so sorry for the pain we caused you. I listened, my own eyes unexpectedly welling up. It wasn't the perfect, movie-script apology I might have once dreamed of, but it was real. It was the sound of a broken person admitting their fault. I didn't offer to solve their financial problems. I didn't promise to rush over and make everything okay. I simply said, thank you for saying that, Mom. I appreciate it. I agreed to meet her for coffee the following week, just the two of us. I set the terms, the time, the public place. It was a cautious first step on a long road. The relationship I had with my parents was gone forever, but perhaps a new one built on a foundation of truth and clearly defined boundaries, could be possible. As for my father and Chloe, I heard nothing. My mother mentioned my father was too proud to apologize, and Chloe was still drifting, blaming everyone but herself. I accepted that some rifts are too deep to be bridged. Reconciliation wasn't about forgetting, it was about accepting the reality of what happened and choosing a new way forward, on my own terms. Looking back on it all now, sitting on the porch of the house that started it all, watching the sunset over the garden Sarah designed, I feel a profound sense of peace. The journey was a crucible, a trial by fire that burned away a lifetime of doubt and misplaced obligation. For so long, I had been running on a treadmill, chasing a validation from my parents that they were incapable of giving. I thought their approval was the finish line. The truth is, the finish line was the moment I realized I didn't need it. The house was never just a house. It was a symbol. It was the physical manifestation of my self-reliance, a monument to every early morning, every splinter, every dollar I saved while they looked the other way. When they tried to take it, they weren't just trying to take a building, they were trying to reclaim ownership over my life, to pull me back into the dysfunctional orbit I had escaped. Their legal challenge, as painful and absurd as it was the greatest gift they ever gave me. It severed the final thread of obligation and allowed me to see them for who they were, not as the all-powerful arbiters of my worth, but as flawed, desperate people whose love was a conditional commodity. The lesson I learned is one that resonates deep in my bones: you cannot build your house on someone else's foundation. Your self-worth has to be your own project, built from the ground up with your own hands. You have to be your own staunchest defender, your own loudest cheerleader. True family isn't determined by blood, it's forged in respect, support, and shared joy. My family now is Sarah, my incredible fiancé. It's Frank, who still comes over for dinner and tells the same old stories. It's my crew, who I trust with my life. It's even Aunt Carol, with whom I now have a genuine bond. My relationship with my mother is a work in progress. It's tentative, marked by carefully respected boundaries. We talk occasionally. She never asks for money, and I never offer. It is quiet and civil. I have not spoken to my father or my sister since that day in the judge's chambers, and I feel no loss. I chose my peace over their poison. And that choice has made all the difference. So, that's my story. It was a long and painful road, but I wouldn't change a thing. It taught me who I am and what I am worth. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to sever a toxic tie to save yourself, let me know in the comments. Your stories are a reminder that none of us are alone in these struggles. Thank you for listening.